Back in 2015, I planned the nicest trip for myself at a secluded spot near a lake, but rain made things worse. I reached the Appalachian Trail at the perfect time, but the rain started. At that time, it was gentle, so I picked up my gear and went up towards my spot. The rain, while I was on the way, started getting louder and harsher. By the time I reached the clearing I'd picked for my campsite, the rain had started to let up, leaving the forest damp and glistening in the faint evening light. In that weather, setting up a tent felt like a challenge. My fingers were numb from the cold, and the lingering drizzle made everything slippery. When I got done with all the chores, the storm had all but passed, leaving a heavy fog in its wake. The mist curled between the trees, blanketing the forest in a weird silence as if all the animals needed rest after enjoying the rain. In that weather, it was peaceful to be in the forest, away from the hustle and bustle of the city and my worries. After hiking a little, I managed to build a small fire and prepare dinner, eating it in silence. I enjoyed the peace, feeling a deep sense of contentment. However, that peace did not last long. After a while, as I leaned back against a log, I heard a strange, growling sound. At first, I thought it must be a deer, but the sound was very faint yet sharp. It couldn't be a deer. I shrugged it off and busied myself on Netflix. Later, it came again. I thought somebody must be hunting deer deep in the woods, which is why they were screaming in pain or fear. I shrugged it off again. Yet, the third time, it was quite loud. I could hear it even though I had headphones on. I started looking to the left with all my focus, trying to make sense of everything. I told myself not to panic. It's just the woods, I thought. They're full of sounds, animals, wind, maybe even the remnants of the storm. I started feeling like there were eyes behind every tree, staring at me. Yet, I forced myself to stay calm, finishing my dinner quickly and tidying up the site. That night, I let the fire flicker because I was afraid and needed light around me. While sitting outside on my chair with my phone in hand, I noticed sudden and quick movement. I pointed my light in the direction of the movement, but the thing or person disappeared. My mind raced with possibilities. A stray hiker, a wolf, maybe even my imagination playing tricks on me. Either way, I decided it was time to retreat to the safety of my tent. Inside, I zipped up the entrance and double-checked my gear, ensuring my pistol, knife, and flashlight were within reach. I stayed seated inside, distracting myself with a mindless series because sleeping that night was impossible with such fear. Although my eyes were on the screen, my heart was pounding. The forest seemed scary, with its weird silence that felt oppressive. While there was a moment in the series showing a handsome guy, I noticed the sound of horrible footsteps outside my camp. They seemed to be approaching the tent, and then circling it. The series scene became less enjoyable as the outside footsteps tightened my throat, making me grip my pistol tightly. However, as the scene ended, the footsteps suddenly stopped, fading back to nothing, as if a person or animal went back to the deep woods. The whole night, I heard such noises. Sometimes animals, sometimes footsteps, sometimes men laughing out loud. All sorts of noises. I kept my eyes on the screen, as those series were a great distraction. Otherwise, I would have bitten my whole lips and driven myself mad. While watching the ending, I didn't realize when the sky started getting lighter and birds began chirping to welcome the sun. That chirping made me put down my phone and sigh with relief. After that, I lay down and slept for a few hours. Around 11 or 12, I woke up and unzipped the tent to step out. While stretching my stiff limbs and walking near the fire, I saw paw prints around my camp. They seemed like the tracks of a bear or large cat. My heart dropped into my mouth, realizing how close the animal had been watching me while I sat by the fire and later when I was inside the camp. The thought sent a shiver through my spine. I had been so vulnerable, so unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the edge of the fog. Without wasting a second, out of fear, I made a decision. Instead of changing clothes and brushing my teeth, I packed my gear and walked down with everything to my car. After an hour-long walk that I covered in half an hour because of fear, I threw my things inside the car and drove, constantly checking the rearview mirror until everything became invisible. All the way, my focus was on the road, even though my mind raced with images of the bear, its hulking form hidden in the mist, its dark eyes fixed on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a fright. On the way, I stopped at an inn to have breakfast and then continued the remaining journey. After around 6 hours, I was home. I bumped onto my couch and relaxed, leaving my things in the car. In my room, I slept for a straight 10 hours. At midnight, I woke up and the first thought was of the bear. The whole experience is still as fresh in my mind as if it happened just yesterday. Even though I've since gone camping multiple times with groups and faced worse situations such as encounters with murderers and legit bears chasing us, that first experience still feels horrible enough to make my skin crawl. I never forget to tell people about it. Leo and I went to the Appalachian Trail for a weekend trip to escape the city and have some we time. We were so excited to go there. We packed only the essentials, ignoring the chilly weather forecast. We brushed off predictions, thinking we'd keep warm by the fire and under layers of our sleeping bags. With thrill, we left for the trip and drove for hours until we found an isolated spot far from any other campers. The stillness was both peaceful yet scary, as there was no one near us, making me think, what if we get into trouble? How would we manage to combat it? I shared my concerns with Leo, but he just hugged me, showing his contacts in a nearby counselor's home. I felt relaxed upon seeing that home, so we pitched our tent in a small clearing among the towering pines. The place was very calming. I managed to sit with Leo most of the time outside, looking at the sky. Later, he set up a campfire, and I just enjoyed the peace. We spent around 20 to 30 minutes preparing dinner. It was very simple, just veggies and sausages with an omelet as a side. Leo liked it. He sprinkled pepper and salt on it with some chilies to make it spicy. He loves Mexican food, and I am anti-spice. After food, I just sat on his chest to get cuddled and felt sleepy while having beer. When my eyes were dying to shut, we finally crawled into the tent. Yet, as we went inside, exhaustion tugged at my eyelids. The cold seemed determined to keep me awake, but I cuddled Leo, hoping his body heat would keep me warm. As sleep began to take over, I felt discomfort, as if somebody was on me, trying to push me harder. I shrugged it off, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. The forest always comes with its scary moments, and my mind uses them to annoy me a little. However, around midnight, I woke and sat up suddenly, my senses on high alert, all focused in fight or flight mode, thinking anything could happen at any moment. I looked around through the thin fabric of the tent, but there was nobody. There was pin-drop silence that was corroding me. Then I heard a sudden growling noise that pounded in my chest, even though I knew it was common in the woods. I looked down at Leo. He was sound asleep, making me feel I was over-imagining things. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it kept engulfing me more and more. I just sat up in the corner, holding Leo's hand while hugging my legs. Leo, meanwhile, stirred beside me, groaning softly as he turned onto his side. "You okay?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the silence, but it was loud enough for him to hear. He nodded but didn't open his eyes. It was obvious he was soundly dozing off. At around 2:30 a.m., out of nowhere, the sound of footsteps started as if somebody was pressing their boots into gravel. In the beginning, it felt like somebody was coming near our tent from far, far away, but with every step, it grew louder and louder until it felt like they were exactly outside our camp. My heart pounded with the growing noise. I could feel that somebody was circling around our tent. It scared me so much that I clutched Leo's arm. "Did you hear that?" He shot up, fully alert now, his eyes wide with alarm. The crunching stopped as if whoever or whatever it was had frozen in place. We sat there, straining to hear, but the silence was deafening. Just as I began to wonder if we'd imagined it, the sound resumed, this time fainter, moving away. What the hell was that? I breathed, my chest tight with fear. Leo didn't answer. He was already rummaging through our gear, his hands shaking as he pulled out a small pellet gun we'd brought for self-defense. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Leo, no," I whispered, grabbing his arm. The idea of him confronting whoever was out there terrified me, but he shook me off gently. "I'll just check." "I'll be right back," he said, his tone meant to reassure me with gentility, though it did anything but. Before I could stop him, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I stayed frozen in place, clutching my knees to my chest as the wind rushed in. I held my breath, listening intently. "Who's out there?" Leo screamed into the darkness, his voice echoing. There was no response. He took a few steps away from the tent, scanning the trees with the flashlight he'd grabbed on his way out. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for him to come back. After around 10 minutes that felt like half an hour, I heard him shout, "Hey! Who are you?" Followed by the sound of footsteps, this time faster, as if someone was running away. Leo stumbled back into the tent, his face pale. "There was someone," he said, his voice shaking. I couldn't see their face, but they were watching us. My stomach dropped. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "We're leaving." "Now," he said, already packing up our things in a frenzy. I helped him, my hands trembling as I stuffed our belongings into our bags. But just as we finished packing, the crunching sound returned, closer this time. My blood ran cold. Leo raised the pellet gun, aiming it at the darkness outside. "Stay behind me," he whispered. The sound stopped abruptly, followed by a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers down my spine. Whoever it was knew we were scared. The laugh faded, and the forest fell silent once more. We didn't wait to find out what would happen next. We just grabbed our gear and bolted to the car. On the way, he texted his counselor friend and called him when he didn't get a reply. All the way, we were tripping over roots and rocks in our haste, and soon reached the nearby home he had pointed out. His friend was there outside, standing. "Come inside," he welcomed us. We sat in the lounge, and he gave us water. "Relax, calm down. It's safe. Nothing is going to happen here." He knew our state. He took us to an empty bedroom that had beds and a cupboard. "You can sleep here. Stay as long as you want to." That night, and the next whole day until noon, we stayed there. His friend was really helpful. Leo found the whole incident funny and laughable, but I'm still in shock, with no courage to go there again. Breakup, parents' divorce, and loss in business all happened together. I was done with life and needed a break. That's why I just packed my things and drove to the Appalachian Trail. The forest, since my teens, has felt like a perfect place to disappear. I used to go there during my teens when my granny was alive, to meet her and spend some time in nature. Yet her death brought me away from the green. But at that time, I needed it. So I drove miles to get my peace back. Soon I reached the place. After parking at a secluded trailhead, I hiked until I found a safe yet peaceful spot. I found a clearing from where I could see other people, and there I set up camp. As I pitched my tent and built a small fire, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Maybe this solitude was exactly what I needed. Yet by night, the silence became intolerable. I tried to focus on the crackling fire, telling myself the discomfort was just my mind playing tricks on me. The silence seemed so oppressive that every rustling of the leaves and snapping of branches pounded in my heart. Then I heard the growl of an engine. My heart jumped. Who would be driving out here, this deep in the woods? A white truck emerged from the trees, its headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. I stood still as it rolled to a stop near my campsite. The man who stepped out, with a black, untrimmed beard and wearing a baseball cap. He smiled, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. "Just passing through. Saw your fire and figured I'd say hello." His voice was friendly, his demeanor disarming. We exchanged pleasantries, and he told me he was a local familiar with the area. When he mentioned the trails ahead being dangerous after dark, I felt a pang of uncertainty. "If you have no issues, I can drop you to the main road," he offered me. "But where would I go at midnight?" I followed my instincts and excused him. He walked away, or at least I thought so. Meanwhile, I texted a counselor, Elliot. I told her the whole situation. "I am coming," she texted me. While I was waiting for her, I noticed he was still there, standing against his car, which scared me. "Why are you still here?" I screamed, as he was far away. "Could not leave you here alone." His words started frightening me. "I am used to it," I said, convincing him to go away. I did not have the guts to fight him at that moment, because it was night, and I could put myself in a risky position by doing that. But I am not used to it. He started walking towards me and sat beside me near the fire. "You know," he said, his eyes fixed on his car, "no one comes out here. It's just us." For a while, I sat there, but then I noticed that he started coming near me, trying to put a hand on my fingers, holding them. That's when I jumped up to stand, clinging to my back pockets to take out my pistol and move to him. "Please leave right now, or I will shoot you. You are just a pookie." He smirked, and it was enough to ignite me. Without a thought, I just shot his hands that he had just raised to make fun of me. "Ah!" he shouted in pain, as if he did not imagine that I would shoot him. "You bitch," he was saying more, but I shot his legs too. All his hands and feet were damaged. I used the moment and tied him to the tree nearby. I tied his fists separately and tied his mouth and eyes too, wanting to save myself only. Thankfully, after just tying him and sitting with trembling hands, Elliot arrived. "What the fuck?" she screamed. With her, I packed all my gear. Meanwhile, she called the police. In 20 minutes, the Rangers were there. I told them everything. "You guys did a great job. We got numerous complaints against him. Thank you. Finally, we caught him because of you." A ranger just took him with them, and I went to Elliot's place with all my things. At night, I stayed awake for most of the time, thinking about the whole scenario and incident. Around 4 or 5 a.m., maybe I slept and woke up after 12 p.m. For 4 days, I stayed at her place, hiking most of the time, getting my breath back. After getting clear-headed, I journeyed back home. Although that incident did affect me, the stay at Elliot's place helped me cope with it and find the peace in my life that I truly needed. Once I reached home, I did not tell anyone about it. I just stayed to myself and got back to normal life. Months later, when we all gathered at a family event and were talking about creepy men, I told them about it. It was an event with my maternal family, so my mom was there. She felt sorry for me, but I told her that all's sorted. Her worry melted my heart, but I could not see her crying. That incident is still with me, but the peace I found there was wholesome. I was 19 years old, just finished my semester, and decided to head to the Appalachian Trail to find some solitude. I packed my gear, drove out to my usual spot, and set up camp. By late afternoon, I decided to hike a trail I knew well, a narrow path that wound through the woods and offered a stunning view at the top. As the sun started to go down, I realized a storm was paving its way and decided to head back. On the way, the rain began coming down in sheets, heavy and relentless. The trail quickly became messy and slippery. I folded my pants to move carefully, but one wrong step on a slick patch sent me tumbling down a steep slope. At that moment, the world spun around me, the sharp sting of branches scratching my skin and the sickening thud as my head hit a rock. Pain shot through my skull, and everything blurred. When I finally came to, the rain was still pounding, drops hitting my face as I lay at the base of the hill, soaked and disoriented. I was utterly exhausted, bruised all over, and could feel blood trickling down. My head throbbed painfully. One thing was clear. I was far from the trail and in dire need of help. Surrounding me were dense trees, and I had no idea how to get back to my campsite. Summoning energy from every bone and nerve, I managed to turn over, raising my hands to crawl. Slowly, I forced myself onto all fours and began climbing toward the top. That's when I saw a small cabin, barely visible through the rain. I could just make out its roof and chimney, smoke sluggishly puffing into the rain-soaked air. I knew it wasn't right to show up unannounced, but desperation pushed me forward. As I stumbled toward the cabin, a truck's headlights pierced the gloom. An older man stepped out wearing a raincoat. All I could see were his mustache, puffy eyes, and dry lips. He looked like a truck driver who had just arrived for a delivery. "You're hurt," he said, his voice deep and calm, as though my appearance hadn't startled him in the slightest. "Get in." I hesitated for a moment, torn between caution and gratitude, but the pain in my head left little room for doubt. I climbed into the truck, clutching my temple as he handed me an old jacket. "Hold that to your head," he said, starting the engine. The ride to town felt surreal. The man didn't say much at first, and I was too weak to ask questions. Eventually, he started talking about his job as a truck driver and how he'd transitioned from army work to private gigs. He shared stories about his time in Afghanistan during the War on Terror and its impact on his family. I remember how steady his hands were on the wheel, how he seemed to know every turn of the winding road despite the downpour. Though I found his stories exhausting, wishing only for silence, they somehow made the ride less eerie. Before I realized it, we had pulled up to the hospital. He stopped the truck and motioned for me to get out. "You'll be fine," he said, his words firm but oddly comforting. I thanked him, fumbling with the jacket as I climbed out. When I turned back to say more, he was already driving away, his taillights disappearing into the rain. At the hospital, the nurses patched me up, commenting on the gash on my head and how lucky I was that someone found me. I told them about the older man, the cabin, and how he'd driven me there. They nodded politely but didn't seem particularly interested. I figured they'd heard stranger stories. I stayed there for a while. Thankfully, I had my wallet and could pay for my injuries. The next day, my dad showed up, sobbing when he saw me lying in the hospital bed. After 2 days, once I was feeling better, I returned to the woods with my dad. I wanted to find the man and thank him properly. We retraced my steps along the trail to where I'd seen the cabin. But when we arrived, there was nothing but an overgrown clearing. No cabin, no truck, just weeds and silence. I couldn't believe it. My dad and I searched the area, calling out in case the man was nearby, but it was as if the cabin had never existed. The realization didn't frighten me but left me utterly confused. How could it have happened? Had I imagined it? Was my injury worse than I thought? Yet, the jacket he'd given me was real. I'd left it at the hospital. Maybe it was help from him. My dad said, urging me to pack up and leave with him. Not wanting to trouble him further, I agreed. That day, I returned to my camp to pack my gear. We headed home, where my mom greeted me with relief, glad I was safe. For 2 months, they didn't let me go anywhere, and I stayed home, focusing on my studies. Years have passed, and now I'm a trainer myself. Yet, when I think back to that incident, I still have so many questions about the man who helped me. Some say he was a good Samaritan living off the grid who moved on. Others think it was sheer coincidence that he appeared when he did. And then there are people like my parents who suggest something more extraordinary, an angel, a ghost, or some force beyond understanding. Though the mystery remains, one thing I know for sure, that man saved my life. And from him, I learned to value others in their moments of need. I am a camping lover, but my girl, Hazel, is a girly girl. She was not ready to go into the woods with me, but I convinced her by showing her shareable pictures of my favorite spots on the Appalachian Trail in Northern California. Ultimately, she said yes, and within an hour, I was done packing. But she took 3 hours. She even packed a few nice event-based shorts, thinking, what if somebody invites me to something fancy? From 10, I reduced her clothes to 5, and that required a lot of effort on my part. Thankfully, she understood my point that we were going camping, not on a honeymoon. On Friday morning, we left, and by late afternoon, we were there. After arriving at the trail, we drove a little further. I was tired from driving, but Hazel's smile made it all worth it. She was legitimately afraid to go there. She packed 5 pepper sprays, 1 5-inch heel, and even a pistol. She's a pistol shooter, but her fear made you doubt her strength. So yeah, I was happy to see her satisfied. Thanks to the scenery for that. Even a devil might turn softer there. Finally, the drive ended when we found a quiet spot just off a little used trail where we could still see people nearby. For a while, we just sat in the car, watching the sunset. I was holding her hand, pulling her close onto my lap, hugging her tight, and kissing her. Her yes had made it all possible, so all credit went to her. She made my old dream of spending time with her in the woods come true. Sweaty inside, with no clothes on us, it felt like a fairy tale. "Can we go out now, honey?" I asked. She nodded, and that's when we put on our clothes and stepped out to set up camp. Before the sky turned dark, everything was ready. The campfire was lit, 2 couch-like things were set near it, and the tent stood behind them. Just as we were about to sit down with our snacks, a couple emerged from the trail. They introduced themselves as Ellis and Luna. Ellis was talkative, wiry, and hyperactive with a sharp smile. Luna, on the other hand, was his complete opposite. She was extremely quiet, her pale blue eyes fixed on the fire as if she were mesmerized by it. Ellis plopped down on a log near our fire, uninvited, but not unwelcome at first. He regaled us with stories of his hikes, his jokes carrying a kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. But as the minutes dragged on, his questions grew uncomfortably personal. "So, how long have you two been together? Do you live alone in the city? Do you tell anyone where you're headed when you go on trips like this?" I felt weird. I didn't even know him, so his line of questioning didn't make sense. Hazel, bold for others but soft for me, spoke up in her fine yet gentle tone. "Why are you asking such things?" In a second, he became awkward. "Sorry, just asking," he said with an embarrassed smile. "Don't be sorry. I was just confused, that's all," Hazel replied, pretending to be the decent girl she always is. Luna, meanwhile, hadn't said a single word the entire time. She just sat there, staring at the fire and occasionally smiling at us. After about half an hour, Ellis stood and stretched. "We're camped deeper in, about 2 miles from here," he said, pointing vaguely into the dense woods. "You two should join us tomorrow. It's more private, and the view is incredible." I forced a polite smile and declined. "We're happy here, but thanks for the offer." Ellis's smile faltered for a split second, replaced by something harder to define: disappointment? Annoyance? He recovered quickly, nodding as if it didn't matter. Luna remained silent. "Suit yourselves," Ellis said, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. They left soon after, their figures swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Hazel and I exchanged uneasy looks. "That was weird," she said, voicing what I'd been thinking. "Yeah, definitely," I replied. "Thanks for shutting him down, my Spice Girl." I hugged her tight. The rest of the weekend passed uneventfully. We spent our days hiking and our nights by the campfire, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together in nature. The memory of Ellis and Luna lingered in the back of my mind, but I chalked it up to the strangeness of meeting people in the wild. It wasn't until we were back in the city, scrolling through socials during an office break, that I felt a weight in my chest. "Police found 2 campers dead in Northern California forest," read the post. My stomach knotted as I clicked, read more. The details were sparse, but the location matched where we'd been camping. The victims were a couple, their identities withheld, found brutally murdered at their campsite. Authorities suspected foul play, but no arrests had been made. Then I saw the photos, breath caught in my throat as I stared at the grainy image of a pale woman with cold blue eyes. It was Luna. In the comments section, I learned Ellis and Luna were serial killers, responsible for the disappearance and deaths of many hikers and campers in that area. The police had been searching for them for 2 years, but they always managed to escape. Hazel, sitting beside me, noticed my reaction and leaned over to see. "Oh my God," she whispered. "They were going to kill us," I said, my voice barely audible. We sat in stunned silence, replaying every moment of that encounter. The questions Ellis had asked, the way Luna had stared at us, the odd invitation to their campsite, it all made sense now. I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Relief that we'd narrowly escaped. Guilt that we hadn't done anything to stop them, though. How could we have known? And fear, an overwhelming fear of how close we'd come to being their next victim. Hazel reached for my hand, her grip tight and trembling. "We're okay," she said, as much to reassure herself as to me. But the thought lingered. If we'd said yes to their invitation, we wouldn't be sitting here now. From that day on, I stopped going into the woods alone with Hazel. She's more precious than a diamond to me, and I don't want to lose her. I still go camping, but either alone or with groups. I took her a few more times, but no more solo trips, never again. I was a camp counselor, and it was my second year training and handling campers at Lakeview Camp near the Appalachian Trail. Over time, I had worked with kids and adults, listened to their fears, and heard their wild stories, ghost sightings, strange noises, and even men chasing them through the woods. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was late, around 2 a.m., and Owen and I were on the night shift, making our rounds to ensure the campers were asleep and everything was in order. The kids had long since settled in, their laughter replaced by the silence of the forest. We stopped by the dock to enjoy the cool breeze off the lake. The water shimmered under the moonlight, a peaceful expanse stretching into the darkness. As we stood there, we noticed something glowing across the lake. It wasn't unusual. Forests often have strange, unexplained lights. We shrugged it off and continued talking. But then we froze, hearing the sharp crack of a gunshot. A deer behind us fell with a thud, shivering in pain. I jumped up from the edge of the dock, heart pounding, and ran toward the deer. "Who's there?" Owen shouted, reaching for the pistol in his pocket. Before we could process what was happening, Owen let out a pained cry. A shot had hit his arm. "Shit," I yelled, panicking. "Shut up," a voice barked back. From the shadows of the woods, a man emerged, paddling toward us in a kayak. His face was obscured, but his presence was chilling. "Don't shout," he sneered, stepping onto the shore. "Give me your belongings, or I'll make you regret it." "Who the hell are you?" Owen demanded, still clutching his injured arm. "I'm bloody harmful," the man replied, aiming his pistol again. He shot Owen's other arm, who screamed in agony. "Give him what he wants, Lucas," Owen cried, his voice breaking from the pain. I knew I had to act carefully. My mind raced as I tossed my wallet toward the man. It was empty of cash, just expired cards and a few scraps of paper. "Money, you bastard," the man growled, his eyes glinting with rage. "Don't you know how to use cards, rascal?" I yelled, trying to keep my voice steady. "The pin is written on one of the papers in the wallet. Use your flashlight, and I'll guide you." The man paused, distracted by the wallet. He bent down to search it, shining his flashlight on the contents. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. With his attention elsewhere, I lunged forward and shot at the arm holding the pistol. He screamed and dropped the weapon, clutching his injured arm. "Run, Owen," I shouted. Owen scrambled to retrieve his pistol as the man tried to grab him. I intercepted, kicking the man's legs out from under him. He fell hard, and I didn't stop there. I hit him in the waist and stomach, determined to cripple him enough to prevent further harm. Rummaging through my bag, I found some scarves and used them to tie the man to a nearby tree. I searched his pockets and found knives, which I confiscated. Even his shoes, socks, and waistband were hiding weapons. Finally, I checked every last crevice, including his undergarments, and removed anything dangerous. Owen, meanwhile, called the rangers. They arrived within 20 minutes, but what happened next sent shivers down my spine. "Where's the guy?" the ranger in charge asked, scanning the area. I turned toward the tree where we'd tied him up, but the ropes were empty. The man was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. "He was right here," I stammered, looking around frantically. One of the dispatchers spoke up, his face pale. "He flew. I saw him rise into the air and disappear." "What the hell are you talking about?" their boss snapped, clearly irritated. "I'm serious, sir," the dispatcher insisted. "It's common around here. He's not a man, he's a spirit." The ranger turned to us, his expression grim. "Do you know what you've just encountered?" Owen and I shook our heads, still trying to process everything. "There's an old legend about this area," the ranger explained. "In 1995, at exactly 2 a.m., an old hiker was mistakenly killed here by locals. Ever since then, his spirit rises at that hour, seeking vengeance. He's been haunting these woods for years, targeting anyone who crosses his path after 2 a.m. The reality of his words sank in. The injuries Owen had sustained were gone, as if they had never existed. Even the deer we'd seen fall earlier was nowhere to be found. It was as if the night's events had been erased, except for the terror etched in our minds. Without a second thought, Owen and I decided to leave the camp. We never returned to that dock after dark. Even now, a year later, the memory lingers like a shadow over my thoughts. The forest, once a place of peace, had revealed its darker, otherworldly side. I learned that night that some stories are not meant to be dismissed. They serve as warnings, a reminder that the wilderness is not just a home for wildlife, but also for spirits with unfinished business. And when you interfere in their realm, you might escape with your life, but never without a lasting scar on your soul. Last college would never end without sharing all our childhood stories. While everyone was reminiscing about the years we had spent together, it was finally my turn. Sebastian and I decided to share a story from my childhood, one I had never told anyone before. You guys ever have a moment where you realize someone you trusted wasn't who you thought they were? I asked, my voice quieter than usual. The group fell silent, curious but sensing the gravity of my tone. "It was a summer, when I was about 12, I began. My parents had sent me to this camp deep in the forests of Virginia, near the Appalachian Trail. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few cabins and a lot of wilderness. The kind of place where kids were supposed to learn survival skills, but mostly just ran around causing mischief." I hesitated, the memory still vivid despite the years that had passed. There were these 2 older boys there, Oliver and Ezra. They weren't exactly my friends, but they were popular, the kind of guys everyone wanted to impress. One afternoon, they asked me to come with them to this secluded stream they'd found. They said they had a game they wanted me to try. My friends leaned in, their expressions a mix of intrigue and concern. "At first, it seemed harmless enough," I continued. "We trekked through the forest, laughing and joking as we went. The stream was beautiful, clear water rushing over smooth stones, surrounded by tall trees that filtered the sunlight into golden beams." Oliver and Ezra pointed out a small wooden platform built beside the stream. They said it was probably left there by older campers years ago. I paused, steadying my voice as the next part of the story weighed heavily on me. They dared me to climb onto the platform and jump into the water below. They kept saying it was shallow, that it was safe, and that everyone who came here did it. I hesitated, but they egged me on, calling me a chicken. I didn't want to look weak, so I climbed up. The memory of that moment still gives me shivers. When I jumped, the water wasn't shallow at all. It was much deeper than I'd expected, and the current was strong enough to pull me under. I panicked. I was a small kid, not a strong swimmer. I struggled to stay afloat, gasping for air and flailing my arms. I looked at my friends, their faces now serious. The worst part, Oliver and Ezra just stood there on the platform, watching. They didn't shout for help. They didn't try to throw me a branch or even jump in. They just watched. I'll never forget the look on their faces. It was as if they were detached, almost bored, like I was some sort of experiment they were observing. My voice wavered as I relived the terror of that moment. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to grab hold of a branch sticking out of the water and pulled myself out. My legs felt like jelly, and my chest burned from coughing up water. When I looked back at the platform, Oliver and Ezra were gone. They just vanished, like cowards slipping into the forest. One of my friends spoke up, her voice filled with disbelief. "They just left you there." "Yeah," I said, nodding slowly. I sat by that stream for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. When I finally made it back to camp, I didn't say a word to anyone, not to the counselors, not to my parents. I was too ashamed. I kept thinking it was my fault, that I should have known better than to trust them. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken questions. I never spoke to Oliver and Ezra again after that summer, I added. When camp ended, I cut them out of my life completely. They tried to talk to me once or twice, but I ignored them. I realized that trust is something sacred, and they'd shattered it in a way I couldn't forgive. One of my friends put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "That's heavy, man, but you made it through. That says a lot about you." I managed a small smile. "Yeah, I guess it does. But it also taught me something important. People aren't always who they seem to be. Sometimes, the ones you think are your friends will leave you when you need them most. And when that happens, you've got to find the strength within yourself to keep going." As I finished my story, the group sat in reflective silence, the weight of my words sinking in. Sharing that memory had been harder than I'd expected, but the best part was realizing that the people around me now had stayed with me through thick and thin. They were, and are, my greatest asset. It's been 4 years, but we're all still in touch. We regularly meet, catch up, and celebrate each other's milestones. Recently, I even helped a friend propose to his girlfriend, and now they're getting married. We've stayed by each other's sides, proof that real friends are the ones who show up and never let you down.